In this tutorial, we're going to be covering all of the basics of Photoshop. It's going to be a bit of a whirlwind of a tutorial, as we're going to be covering all the interface items, the tools, and just kind of the ins and outs of Photoshop. So this is geared at those who are absolute beginners at Photoshop, just starting out. Don't worry, as we will be learning each of the tools and things we talk about in this video in much more detail in future video tutorials. This is mostly an overview tutorial to get you up and started with the basics of Photoshop in just a short amount of time. So let's get started. The first thing I actually want to show you is how you can reset Photoshop's preferences to get back to square one. So if your Photoshop has menus and things and settings that are all changed and not quite working the same way my video tutorials are working, you want to go ahead and reset Photoshop. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do that, but one really easy way is if you just quit Adobe Photoshop and then you come down here to launch it again, what you do is you hold down on your keyboard Command, Option, and Shift, those three keys, then you click to launch Photoshop or double click. And you can see what that does is it launches this little setting that says, do you want to delete the Adobe Photoshop settings file? I can go ahead and say yes, and that essentially will delete that master settings file, kind of resetting Photoshop back to its default. So now you can see I've sort of got a blank slate here. So if you ever find yourself a little bit stuck or things are just kind of wonky and not working correctly, go ahead and reset that and you should be back to square one. Now, the first thing you land on in Photoshop is the welcome screen. So this is kind of the welcome screen where you can create new presets and new documents and whatnot. They have a Learn tab where you can watch some video tutorials and things like that. Most of the time, you're either going to be creating a new document or opening an existing document. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and click the Create New button. Now, while you can use all of these various presets, most of the time, you're just going to be working with this area right here and manually inputting the width and height. So you can see here we have a width, we have a height. You can work with either pixels, inches, or your unit of measure. For this example, we're going to be sticking here with pixels. I'm just going to create a document that is 1000 wide and height, we're going to maybe do 800 pixels. Of course, you can change the orientation from landscape to portrait, and you can opt to use artboards or not. We'll discuss artboards in a future video. For this example, I'm going to turn them off. Then the resolution, I'm going to be setting here to 72 pixels per inch, and all the rest of the things I'm going to leave as default. We're going to be working with an RGB document, a background layer of white, and then a few options here for color management. So go ahead and click the Create button, and this will launch you into the Adobe Photoshop interface. Now, by default, when you get into Adobe Photoshop, you get all sorts of tabs and sliders and windows and things like that, and they're all fully customizable. So I can grab one of these little panels over here, and I can drag it and undock it, and I can choose to dock it to a different location. You can just hover around here, and an area that turns blue means it's dockable. So maybe I want to stick this right here, and now it's going to be there in my layout. In other words, all of the panels and windows you can drag around and fully customize the interface of Adobe Photoshop. Now, oftentimes, if you accidentally drag a window and you kind of get confused, you'll need to reset back to the default, what's known as Workspace. So whenever you customize the layout, you're customizing a workspace. So if you want to reset, you just can simply come over here to this little icon right here. So if you click on this, you can see there's a bunch of preset workspaces. So if I switch to the 3D workspace, notice the interface changes. If I switch to the painting, notice the interface changes. And we can always come down here and say Reset Workspace. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to Essentials, which is the default, and I'm going to click on this Reset Essentials. So then that sort of gets it back to square one. Notice that my color panel went back up to where it used to be. Now by default in Adobe Photoshop, they have this Learn. Sort of this big entire right column is called Learn, and they have this thing called Creative Libraries. I don't like that at all. So we're going to get rid of those permanently in Photoshop and save our own custom preset. So Learn is just like a bunch of help tutorials. Again, you can watch those, of course, but it's not helpful to have that in your interface. We want all the real estate and screen space we need. So we're going to get rid of that one. This Libraries one lets you connect with the Creative Cloud library. So if you're saving your documents in the cloud and moving between a desktop and a laptop and your work and home and things like that, this may be useful to you, but I don't like the Creative Cloud file management, so I'm going to turn that off. So we're just going to get rid of this one as well, and we're going to close that. So this is essentially the default workspace that we're going to be working with throughout all of the video series in Photoshop. We're just going to stay with Essentials so that we're all looking at the same interface. Now, if I quit Photoshop right now and relaunch it, it's going to stick those two tabs back. So what I need to do now is I need to save my own workspace. So you can come here to the Workspace tab, and I'm just going to call this New Workspace. And I'm just going to call mine Follow Andrew. You can call yours, of course, whatever you want, My World or something like that. And I want to remember all of these things, the toolbars, the menus, the shortcuts, and just go ahead and hit Save. And now notice that I'm here and I'm in the Follow Andrew workspace. So if I switch over to the motion by accident, or I accidentally delete something, I can always come over here, click, and go back to my Follow Andrew. And then if something's messed up, I can always reset the Follow Andrew. That way I'm back to square one and everything should be correct. So that's how you want to set up your Photoshop to follow along with all this series, so that you get rid of that right-hand column, you have your own custom workspace, and let's go ahead and look at the rest. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is just the basics of the interface here. Now at the very top of Photoshop, you have what are known as the menus. So M-E-N-U. So all of these items right here are what we call menus, and these are all menu items. So when you hear me say go to the image menu, I'm talking about the topmost menu called image. So if I say go to the filter menu, you come over to the filter menu, etc., etc. So all of these are the menus inside of Photoshop that have various commands and things like that we'll be using in the future. This little area right here, so this right here is what we call the edit bar. So this is a dynamic area, meaning that this area will update and change based on the tool that you have active, or the layer, or the object you have selected. So for example, right now I have the marquee tool selected, but watch what happens if I come down here and maybe select the square vector tool. Notice that all of these options up here suddenly changed. And if I switch back to the marquee tool, notice how they all changed again. So again, this is a dynamic bar, meaning that it will change based on the active tool you have selected, because each tool has its own sets of settings and whatnot. Okay. The next area here is just this far left column. We simply call this the toolbar. So this is all of the main tools that you'll work with inside of Photoshop to draw, paint, cut, create text, and do graphic design or photo work inside of Photoshop. So it has all your painting tools, your brush tools, and selection tools, and things like that. So we'll cover each one of these in depth in a future video tutorial so you can see exactly what every tool does, but this is where they all hide out. Now down here inside of Photoshop, there's a couple of important little areas that we need to pay attention to, and that's these little icons right here, okay? So the first one, and perhaps the most important, are the two main colors. So there is a foreground color, and then right behind it, there is a background color. Now the foreground color is simply a color that Photoshop remembers that we'll paint with. So I'm going to set these to two very different colors. So I'm going to go red here, and then if you double click on this little icon, the little color swatch, double click, that will bring up the color picker and you can choose a new color. So I'll go green and red. Now what happens here is if I get my brush tool, so I'm going to select my brush tool, B is the keyboard shortcut to select the brush tool, I can just paint here on my layer, and notice it's painting using that foreground color. So the foreground color is always the active color. But if I click this little teeny tiny icon right here, it will switch. So notice when I click this, it switches the two colors. So now my background color is now my foreground color. And now I can paint with that color as well. So Photoshop has sort of two colors that it keeps preserved at all times. And you can just switch back and forth between them using that little option there. There's also a keyboard shortcut for that, and the keyboard shortcut is X. So if you press X on your keyboard, it switches between the foreground and background color. If you press D on your keyboard, D for dog, it will switch back to black and white. So you may ask yourself, why is there two colors stored inside of Photoshop? That's kind of weird. Why doesn't it just have one? And the reason for that is typically when you're working with black and white. It's very often, as you'll see in the future when working in Photoshop, when you're creating masks and some more advanced things, to be using the colors black and white. So often what you'll do is you'll have your brush tool and you'll paint with some black, and then you can hit X on your keyboard and paint with some white, hit X, paint with some black, back and forth really easily. So that's why they have those two main colors. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and look at these other two icons really quick. So this last one here is called quick mask mode. And then this other one here is where you can change the screen mode. So notice if I, whoops, I'm zoomed out. If I click this button, it sort of changes the panels to be floating or non-floating and a few things like that. Or back into full screen. So every time if you want to get out of full screen, you can just hit escape. But that's what this little guy does. It just simply toggles between a few of the different modes of Photoshop's viewing. Now this one right here, this quick mask mode, people accidentally get into this mode a lot and they don't know what happened. And the reason being is that it has a keyboard shortcut associated with it. So if you accidentally hit Q on your keyboard, notice how that little icon got pushed in. It's now depressed. And notice how over here in my layers panel, this turned red. That's really the only indication that you have if you're in quick mask mode. So oftentimes people will be working and they hit quick mask mode and then they're trying to do stuff and they're like, wait, why am I painting with red? Black is my color here. It's painting with red and things get really confusing. And so if you find things are kind of not working the way you expect in Photoshop or your colors are weird, double check to see if you are accidentally in quick mask mode. And if you are, simply click the icon or press Q again. That takes you out of quick mask mode. Notice now I have this selection, but that's kind of something you need to double check because quick mask mode is a way of selecting things. Again, we'll cover that in much more detail in the future. Okay, so that is the toolbar inside of Adobe Photoshop. So we have up here our edit bar with our settings. We have our toolbar on the left, and on the far right, we have what are known as panels or panes, okay? Now, again, there's lots and lots of panels and panes, and this area too is also dynamic. So we're gonna look at the very top couple here that appear. So the first one is just the color. It's just an alternate way for you to select, different colors. The second one over here is called swatches. This is just predefined sets of color cubes. So I can set up predefined sets and then I can come in here and just, select them one by one. I can also create my own sets and things like that, import and export these. Then we have gradient presets. So these are just presets of gradients where two colors, go from one to another color gradually or multiple colors. And then we have patterns. So patterns are things that are like tileable repeating patterns like grass or rocks or wallpaper or something like that on your walls. So patterns. All right, so those are the four things that are inside of here: color, swatches, gradients, and patterns. Now the next one down is much more important and interesting because this one is called the properties panel. The properties panel is much like the edit bar where everything is going to be dynamic. So for example, if I click on my marquee tool and I select, I come in here and actually I'm gonna get a brush and just make some brush changes. Then I'll get another shape here like I did before and draw out a little square. Notice that the properties panel is changing depending on what my active layer is. So if I choose this layer, this has got a shape object on it. These are all the properties of the shape. If I come here to my background layer, this is a raster layer. I'm now seeing the properties of those pixels, essentially. So the properties panel is very useful. Again, it depends on what you have selected. For example, I'm going to come in here and just create what is known as an adjustment layer. I'll create a curves adjustment layer. And notice when I have the curves adjustment layer highlighted, all of the properties are the properties of the curves modification. If I come back and select the rectangle, now I'm looking at the properties of this shape, etc., etc., etc. So again, that is a dynamic panel. It's dependent on what you have actively selected. The adjustments tab here is just another way of getting at all of these exact same commands. They're identical. It's just another way of getting at these things. And then lastly here we have the layers panel. Now one little trick I want to show you before we look at the layers panel. If you double click a title, I suppose, the tab title. So watch what happens when I double click the adjustments. Notice how it collapses down. So that's kind of a quick way you can sort of shrink things or get them out of the road temporarily. Simply double click to make them pop back up. So I use this quite often, especially when I'm working with a large number of layers and I want to see a few more. I just may want to quickly collapse that and quickly collapse this so that I can see a whole bunch of layers at once. And then if I need, I can always double click that to pop it back out. So I'm going to leave those collapsed for a minute while we look here at the layers panel. Now the layers panel is, one of the more important areas because you're going to be doing most of your work in the layers panel and inside of the tools panel. So everything inside of Adobe Photoshop is based on this concept of layers. And layers are stackable, meaning that the bottommost layer sits behind everything else. And if I create another layer on top of it, for example, this layer right here, my rectangle, notice how my rectangle is in front of all these lines, and all these lines are on my background layer. That's called the stacking order. So here's my background layer, here's layer 1, here's layer 2, here's layer 3, here's layer 4, right? So they all sort of stack on top of one another. And you can easily modify that by simply dragging and dropping. Now I'm going to take this curves layer. I actually don't need that anymore, so I can select it and I can drag it down to the trash can icon and let go, and that will delete that layer. I'm going to create a couple more layers here. So to create a new layer, you simply press, the create new layer icon is right here, this little plus icon. So if I click that icon, notice it creates a new blank layer. And I'm going to come over here on this layer and I'll just add some text to kind of illustrate this over here. So we'll drop in some text and I'll say hello. And notice that text is super, super tiny. That's okay. I'm going to hit Command T on my keyboard to free transform and scale that up a bit. Okay, so I've got sort of 3 layers here. And notice my text layer is on top. However, if I grab this layer and I drag it underneath my rectangle layer, and then I move this layer, so I'm going to get my move tool, I'm going to grab my hello and move it down here. Notice how it's underneath my rectangle. And I can sort of just switch the stacking order, see, back and forth, and I can drag any layer on top of any layer. Now if I grab my background layer and try to move it up to the top, notice it says, sorry, you can't do that. And that's because Photoshop comes pre-built with a layer called background. Notice how it's called background. And see the little lock icon right here? That means that this layer is a special layer. It should always be the bottommost layer or the backgroundmost layer. And it also has some limited functionality. I can't apply filters or a few things like that to that layer. Now, personally, I do not like the background layer at all inside of Adobe Photoshop. So the first thing I always do, and I recommend you do the same thing, is get rid of the background layer. There's 2 ways you can do that. You can simply delete it, or you can double click the layer. So if you double click the layer and just hit OK, that takes the background layer and converts it to a regular layer. So now that I have the regular layer, notice I can move it around wherever I want and it can stack on top of these other layers. Okay, so just as a recap here, whenever you say File New, and you create a new document, I'm just going to create another default document here and hit Create. Notice there's a background layer. Again, step 1, double click it and hit OK. Convert it to a regular layer. I personally see 0 instances where you would ever want a special layer in Photoshop that has limited capability to confuse you. So I always get rid of it, and I recommend you do the same thing. That way all of your layers behave the same. Of course, the bottommost layer is your backgroundmost layer, and it can behave as such. So now that I have 2 documents open, I can show you the tabs. So up here at the top left, notice how I have document 1 right here, and it sits right here. And if I click on my second document, it's right here. So you can have multiple documents open inside of Adobe Photoshop, and they just simply appear as tabs right here. You can even drag and drop things between documents. So for example, if I want this rectangle to be on my other document, I can click this layer and hold my mouse button, bring it up to this tab and just rest for a second till it pops open, bring it down here and drop. And now I've essentially copied that layer. Notice it still exists in my first document, but I've copied that layer over and put it into my second document. So you can always drag and drop between documents if you need to copy things back and forth, which you'll do quite often in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and close down this second document and say don't save. And we'll stay back here on our first document. So that is the layers panel, and that's where you can create layers and rearrange the layers. The only other thing I'll tell you about the layers is that if you want, you can give these things some color labels. So I personally don't use this feature a whole lot, but some people really like it. So if I click on this layer right here, I can come into my, if you right click using the right mouse or right click button, notice how there's these labels. So I can make this one orange, and I can come over here and right click and I can make this one green. So if you want to like organize your layers and just give them labels that make sense to you for something, you can go ahead and do that. Again, that's a little feature that I really don't use quite often, but some people find it really helpful. Okay, there's a few other little things in here that we're going to look at: opacity, fill, and all these little things, and this things, and all of these things, the switches and toggles. We're going to look at that in the future. Don't really need to worry about that. So the last little area down here at the bottom is where are the common areas for layer commands are. So what you can do here is, this is called the layer styles. So I can apply layer styles right here. You can also get to all these things by going to the layer menu and applying layer styles. Most of the things down here you can also get to in the menus. The second icon here is the mask icon, where you'll create layer masks. This is something you'll be doing a ton in Photoshop. So the mask icon is a shortcut right there. Then we have all these adjustment layers, which I looked at earlier. Over here, we have a folder. So I'm going to create a folder. A folder is nothing more than a group inside of Photoshop. So I can create a whole bunch of folders, and then I can drag and drop my layers into these folders. So if I highlight two, I held down Shift. So I click this one, hold down Shift to click this one. So I have multiple layers selected at once. Click and drag and drop those into that folder. Notice now they're in this group 3 folder. So you can sort of create folders to organize sets of things, and that's something you'll do quite often to keep things organized. As when you're working with Photoshop, you tend to get a lot of layers, so you want to keep those organized. Now, in order to name layers or groups, you simply just come in here and double click. So if I double click, I can call this My Fancy Thing, and I can name that whatever I want. You can also name layers the same way. So if I double click and name a layer, I can call this Blue Square, etc., etc. So you can name all of your layers. That's something that makes sense. That's something you want to get in the habit of doing. It's really easy, especially for me when I do the video tutorials, because I'm just going through things. I don't want to take 2 or 3 hours doing concepts. I often won't name my layers. That's not great practice. You want to get in the habit of just when you create a layer or a group, name it something that makes sense to you. It doesn't really matter, just a convention that makes sense to you. All right, the little eyeball icon over here to the left is what we call the layer visibility. So that's basically whether the layer is visible on your canvas or not. So this area, the main area that you see where you work on in Photoshop, is called the canvas. So if I come over here to this group and I click that eyeball icon, notice all of the layers in that group are now hidden. They're still, of course, there, they're just not visible. So I can always click that to turn them back on. I can drag this whole group down to the bottom. I can toggle individual layers on and off. And a nice shortcut is if you click on the top and drag your mouse down, it will hide all the layers that you went through. And if you click on the bottom and drag back up, it will unhide all of those layers. If you hold down Option and click a single eyeball icon, I'm going to go, let's see, the text one. Hold down Option and click that one. It will hide everything but that layer. So that's a quick way where you can easily hide everything to kind of isolate something, look at it. Hold down Option and click again, and it will turn everything back on. That's a keyboard shortcut I use a lot. Okay, so that sort of overviews most of the interface of Adobe Photoshop and kind of the common or most commonly used panels. The only other thing I want to point you to before we finish up this intro to Photoshop is down here in the bottom left, you'll see your zoom level. So we have what's known as 100%. I'm going to zoom in right here so you can see it. See how it says 100%? What that means is that every pixel of my document is mapped to 1 pixel on my screen. Okay? That's what 100% view means. It's a pixel to pixel mapping. Now, I can zoom in or zoom out on my Photoshop document. Oftentimes you will when you want to do some detail work. So if I get my zoom tool here, the keyboard shortcut for that is Z, and you can do this a couple ways, but if you click and drag to the right, it will zoom in, and if you drag to the left, it will zoom out. So this is called scrubby zoom. So I can zoom in and out of my Photoshop document. So if I want to zoom all the way in and do a little bit of detail work right here, notice now my zoom factor is 4000%. Okay, so that's an easy way you can zoom in and out. So oftentimes you'll be zoomed in and you want to get back to 100%. There's a lot of ways you can do that. I'm going to show you a couple here. So I can come over here to my zoom and I can just double click. I can punch in the keys 100 and hit return. That takes me back to 100%. Okay, so that's method one. If I'm zoomed way in, I can also hit on my keyboard, the keyboard shortcut Command and then the number 1. That zooms me back to 100%. So that's method 2. The next method is if I'm zoomed in or out, I can double click on the zoom tool itself and take me back to 100%. So all of those 3 methods do the exact same thing. It's just kind of different ways of working. If you do the Command 2 on your keyboard, or not Command 2, Command plus, sorry. If you do Command plus, it zooms you in by 100% at a time, and Command minus zooms you out by 100% at a time. You can see down there the zoom factor is going 700, 800, 900, etc. So Command plus and Command minus will do that, and that's kind of how that works. 2 more little zoom commands here. If you double click on the hand tool, this is called zoom to fit. So basically it zooms your Photoshop document until one of the edges, either the top or bottom or left and right, hit the top or bottom and left and right edges of your Photoshop screen. So notice now I'm at 249% view. So if you're zoomed way in and you kind of want to just get down to a zoom to fit, you can double click the hand and it will take you right to zoom to fit. Or another way of doing that same thing, you can hit Command 0 and that's zoom to fit. So you'll find that as you work through Photoshop, there is a zillion shortcuts. Like I've kind of given you quite a few in this intro tutorial of working with Photoshop. And you want to try to get the hang of those shortcuts. Again, I don't expect you to remember anything really in this intro video, just to kind of get familiar with all these different options. But using the shortcuts in Photoshop is really going to save you so much time in the future. So when you're starting out, while it's okay to come over here and click the zoom tool and click and move up, or come over here and click a menu and say new, pay attention to all of the keyboard shortcuts. Eventually, if you want to master Photoshop, you'll want to master the shortcuts. Because using all those little shortcuts to navigate saves you a lot of time in the end by having to drag and go around and click through menus. So if you hover over a tool, if you hover your mouse over a tool and just leave it there for a second, it will show you the keyboard shortcut for that tool. Notice this is the lasso tool and the keyboard shortcut is L. So in other words, if I have this tool active and I press the L key, it automatically switches me to the lasso tool. And if I press the V key, it switches me back to the move tool. And if I press the B key, it switches me over to the brush tool. Okay, and that's how you can switch between all of the tools in Photoshop. Again, just hover over and it will tell you right there, S for the clone stamp, the keyboard shortcut for each individual tool. Now, these are all of the main tools of Adobe Photoshop. Each tool that has a little teeny tiny arrow there, you can see that little right arrow right where my cursor is. That means this tool has several sub-tools as well. If you click and hold the mouse button down, you will see all of the sub-tools of Adobe Photoshop right there. So this eyedropper tool has a 3D eyedropper, a color sampler, a ruler, a note, a counter tool. And there's lots and lots of tools tucked away underneath the main tool. See all these right here? Now this is kind of a little bit weird, but you can also toggle between all of these sub-tools with the keyboard shortcut as well. So again, I'm going to select the move tool. Let's say I want to go to the brush tool. I press B, but let's say I wanted to actually go to the mixer brush tool. Well, what you do is you hold down Shift and then press B, and this will cycle between all of the sub-tools of that main tool. Okay, so notice how my icon's changing there. So then I can hit that a couple times until I get down to whatever tool I'm after. That's the mixer brush, and now I'm going to be painting with the mixer brush. Okay, so that works for any tool that you have active. So for example, up here in the marquee tools, if I press M for marquee and then I hit Shift M, it will cycle between all of the marquee subtools. Okay, so I think that's mostly everything you need to know in this intro to Photoshop video. So I hope you learned just kind of a little bit about the interface, and in all the future videos we're going to be covering with Adobe Photoshop, we're going to learn everything you need to know to get you from basically knowing nothing about pixels and Photoshop and digital images and creation and graphics to an intermediate level. So follow along, stay tuned, and we will see you in the next one.